Recording in progress.
Wonderful. So good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome. My name is Martin Kaltenberg from Semantic Web Company, and I'm here together with Jan Jürgens of Fraunhofer and University of Koblenz. And we're happy to welcome you to the TRUSTS session. So what we're going to do now is we have two talks and presentations. Jan Jürgens will start and tell you more about the overall TRUSTS project, give you insights about this area. It's all about data sharing, secure data sharing in data spaces. And as a second talk, I will take over and tell you a little bit more about the importance and how we do interoperability in the TRUSTS environment based on the talk of Jan. So Jan, the floor is yours. I will disappear for a moment and take over later. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Martin, for kicking this off. And I will now share my slides. Yeah, so as Martin already just said, I now have the honor to give a brief introduction about what the TRUSTS project is all about. And of course, Martin and myself are only two of the participants in the project. Many more should be mentioned. Of course, some of them are mentioned here on the slide. This includes our coordinator, Alexandra from the University of Hanover, as well as her colleagues supporting her in that role. But of course, the whole consortium, as we will also see on one of the next slides. Yeah, before I get to that, I start off with a very high-level motivation for why I think it's a good idea that the EU invests quite a bit of money in the topic of data sharing and data spaces. With our project, not only, also the other projects in the same funding call that was launched a couple of years ago, but also, of course, still now with the upcoming calls that are still around, many of them around data spaces. And the point is, of course, looking at this figure on the right-hand side of the slide, we can again notice that there is a huge market for data, and unfortunately, the large players are, well, from different continents, not including Europe, which in some sense is fine. As Europe, we don't necessarily have to do everything. That's sort of a global division of labor. On the other hand, there's a threat that because the data is so central now and it will become even more central in the future, you can basically roll up whole business models starting with the data, and you can control in the future many business models if you control the data. And this is, of course, a bit more worrying. So it's important that European industry manages to make some kind of counterbalance against this unbalanced picture that you see here on the slide. And this is the topic of federating IT infrastructures. Of course, there's lots of initiatives now going on, including, for example, also Gaia X, as we will mention also in this short introduction. But the point here is, from our point of view of the TRUSTS project, for that kind of federation, whether you federate clouds or whether you federate software services dealing with the data, you always need some way of trusted data sharing. So that's the precondition for being able to do that. And this is where we as a project try to support. So that's now the project TRUSTS. Short context, yeah, we started in the beginning of 2020. We are now approaching the end of our second year. So we have, in fact, quite promising and I think, very exciting results to present. And we have another year to go to finish our project results. Some general motivation and goals. As mentioned already, we need trusted data sharing for personal as well as industrial data, and it really needs to be trusted and secure to be able to be usable. Needs to respect privacy laws, data protection regulations. If you deal with personal data, obviously you have to do that. There's the important issue of interoperability, which, as Martin just mentioned, he will actually talk about in more depth in the second presentation in our slot. Of course, lots of other challenges, scalability, computational efficiency, but in particular, privacy and confidentiality of the data that is supposed to be shared. Yeah, so that's the project. As mentioned already, our coordinator is University of Hanover. Yeah, then there's I think very good consortium of very well-known and very good partners to work with. I don't have to name them all. I think you see them on the slide. So I think it's a really great consortium with lots of exciting backgrounds, which we bring together here in order to push ourselves further to reach the goals, the very ambitious goals that we put ourselves to reach here. So what are these goals? What are the challenges we would like to overcome? Lack of trusted and secure platforms. Therefore, limited sharing of data. And I already mentioned why this is a problem for European industry. And another challenge, diverging standards and quality and legal aspects, which is also a hindrance towards sharing data as much as industry would like to do and would like to be able to. So we would like to address those challenges by developing results, technical results, and also scientific results, which allow the integration and adoption of future data sharing platforms to be able to act independently and also as a platform federator. So also for us, the issue of federation of IT infrastructures is quite central. The concepts we are developing also in particular allow you to federate data spaces. We don't just want to develop one space, but also support the possibility to federate data spaces in various application domains. And of course, we have to investigate the legal and ethical challenges that arise from the goal of wanting to share and exchange data, including personal data and critical and confidential data, and all the regulations that relate to that. So what is our goal and what are the backgrounds we bring into the project to build upon? Goal, again, pan-European solution for trusted data sharing space and the federation of such spaces. Our goal is to help building the digital single market, which of course is an ambitious goal in the EU. And we are quite happy and quite lucky to be able to build on the backgrounds of two very successful projects that have had this goal already, even before the start of the TRUSTS project, including the Data Market Austria initiative, where there were already research prototypes developed towards the goal that we want to take further in this project, as well as the initiative of the international data spaces and the corresponding ITSA association, which is an industry initiative that very much has the goal to develop the topic of data spaces, and where, in fact, currently there's a lot of work and a lot of initiative also towards integrating with other current developments, such as Gaia X, as mentioned already, where, for example, at the technical level, the IDS connector that we are also using as part of our project here is currently becoming the Gaia X data space Eclipse connector. So we're having a very tight integration in our project with existing initiatives such as IDS, but also with ongoing initiatives such as Gaia X on this very technical level by making use of that IDS connector. And this is how we would like to not only develop the technological framework, but also make it usable in the context of these existing initiatives. So just another slide on IDSA. You may have heard about the International Data Spaces initiative already. Just one slide about what the current IDS association looks like. Around 130 companies from across Europe and also beyond that are interested in further developing and using the kind of infrastructure that is developed in the IDS context, and which we are also building on in the context of the TRUSTS projects. So basically, we can also profit from the possible to disseminate our results for example, in the context of this association. Just another slide on IDS versus Gaia-X. So I mentioned that the IDS connector is currently being integrated in the Gaia-X architecture, and this is basically the picture that corresponds to that statement, where you can see the IDS connector here in the middle of that X, which is the usual abstract description of the Gaia-X architecture and the corresponding goals that are supposed to be reached with Gaia-X. And as you can see, the IDS connector is deeply integrated in that architecture, and this is how we can also link up to this larger initiative from the TRUSTS project. So aim, again, creating a secure and trustworthy secure data sharing space for personal as well as industrial data. And second main aim, link the data community, the public and various application sectors via the functionalities that are provided by the TRUSTS platform. So more concretely, the goal is to set up a fully operational and GDPR compliant, trusted, secure European data sharing space, and to demonstrate and realize the potential of the TRUSTS platform in 3 business cases that we are also working on as part of the TRUSTS project. And these are those use cases. So as you can see, they are very much clustered around financial services in different directions. So the first of these use cases is actually directly in financial, namely anti-money laundering compliance. So basically here, finance and compliance meet, and obviously these are very sensitive data that have to be analyzed here and computed in order to make sure that the compliance regulations are being met. And this is therefore a very good demonstrator for TRUSTS, because TRUST has the goal of to be a trusted data sharing space. And that's also something you really need in this use case here. So that's a very fitting use case to the TRUST project. The second one is in fact a combination of financial and telecom application domain, where the goal is to be able to do agile marketing through data correlation, where again, the data is also derived from the financial sector. And the goal here is now to be able to do data analytics based on the TRUSTS data sharing platform, and to develop this into marketing facilities. Of course, again, GDPR compliant, meaning that, for example, you have to make sure that the personal data that is being processed, that this is only done within the agreement of the people who provide that data. Plus, we have to make sure that if data is being shared, that this is being done in a controlled way. So on the basis of bilateral agreement between the data provider and the data analyzer. And so in particular, TRUSTS is not a data lake where you can just dump in your data and then everyone can have it. But the data sharing has only been done on the basis of agreed contracts and agreed regulations between the data user and the data provider. And third use case, also again arising from the financial sector, but of a more general nature, is that of data acquisition to improve customer support service. Again, of course, an issue which touches on personal data, and so again, the issue of privacy regulations and the compliance is very central here. So yeah, as I said, we are coming towards the end of the second year of the project. So in fact, we have already quite a number of very exciting, I think, results we can mention here, just being constrained by the time available. I give a couple of examples because for time reasons, of course, I cannot present all of them here within these 20 minutes. But some of the things we've done is to produce an analysis of the academic landscape as well as the industrial site conditions and requirements with respect to macro and competitive environment for a trusted data sharing space, taking into account expert voices based on interviews, and in particular also taking into account the telecom and financial industries more specifically, which is also again where our use cases are based. So this is one particular use case and application domain that is particularly interesting for us. And as I mentioned already, we're aligning very closely with existing initiatives such as Gaia-X, but also the EU strategy for data, and of course BDVA and DARO, just as some of the initiatives that are of course very important here, and which we are making sure that we are closely lined up with. So some further achievements, as again, I can only give a couple of examples here for time reasons, but I mentioned several times already that because the goal is to be able to also use our platform for personal data, data protection is a very important and very central issue here. So some of the things we're working on is to improve privacy preserving technologies. And indeed, we have been developing several software solutions based on the research in the project, including a new library for private set intersection, which is a very important technique in order to provide privacy-preserving technologies, encrypted transfer learning prototypes to enable the platform to work on based on encrypted data as far as possible, because as long as you don't have to decrypt the data, your of course your confidentiality levels are much better protected. Denomination risk analysis modules, of course, that's a very important issue because firstly, in many situations, you will anonymize data in order to adhere to privacy requirements. But the risk is always, as mentioned here, that the data might be de-anonymized based on external knowledge that the attacker might have. And therefore, it's important to be able to defend against that. And all of it also including an ensemble learning solution that again supports the privacy preserving technologies. And again, linking up with important initiatives like BDVA, also with respect to our publication strategy. Okay, so I'm getting to the end of my planned 20 minutes before Martin takes over with the second talk. Just a short summary, firstly, of the TRUSTS contribution. Yeah, we have been developing results that help ensuring the trust in the concept of data spaces by the focus on developing a platform which is based on the multidisciplinary experience of our consortium. The platform allows the integration and adoption of future platforms by means of interoperability, and Martin will tell us more about that in the second part. And we have also been investigating the legal and ethical aspects of this data sharing topic. And in fact, also the TRUSTS platform will be able to act as a platform federator in particular. So just as a final slide, as I mentioned already, of course, we are also having an eye open about future possibilities for realizing projects along across the topic of data sharing. And as you probably all know, there are actually quite a few possibilities coming up at this very moment, both within Horizon Europe as well as Digital Europe, and obviously based on the results of the projects, many of us will be very interested in pushing things further and thinking about follow-on projects. So if you're interested in the topic of trustworthy data sharing and would like to push this further together with us, then yeah, please let us know, and I'm sure we will be happy to talk about this possibility. As such, I'm at the end of my presentation, and as we discussed with Martin, he will now continue with his presentation, and after his presentation, we will then have a joint question and answer session.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jan, for this. So we just do the change in our screen sharing, and I hope you can see my screen coming up now, saying TRUSTS
Yes, very good.
Metadata interoperability. Yeah, thank you so much, Jan. I think that was a very good introduction into the overall TRUSTS project, but also already tackling topics about secure data sharing, because there was a question also, we can open it afterwards in the chat, saying, okay, how do you ensure trust in TRUSTS? So nice gaming a word. However, we'll come back to this question. So happy to take over now. My name is Martin Kaltenberg of Semantic Web Company. And here you see the introduction. Well, I introduce myself with a kind of a little graph. So as you can see, I'm CFO and co-founder of Semantic Web Company. We are vendor of a tool that is called Pool Party Semantic Suite that is provided to customers worldwide in the area. And this is the left-hand side here of knowledge graphs. And we are using semantic web standards, and this standard approach and the knowledge graphs is already a little bit a teaser of what happens now, because going into the next slide, thanks to Jan's presentation, you have already learned about these 4 main contributions of TRUSTS. And Jan already said, I will take over one of these 3. I will take the topic of interoperability here, because TRUSTS has to provide mechanisms for easy metadata and data ingestion, but also integration. And we are somehow a federator between different marketplaces. So what is needed is interoperability. To be sure we are aligned here, I took a few interoperability definitions. So you see there is interoperability, and I will not read it, you can read it yourself. But what does it mean? That systems seamless in principle can communicate and can also work with each other, and they can do it continuously. So without any restriction, as I said here. If you go to the area of data interoperability, you can imagine the next step here. So you say systems that are creating, exchanging, consuming data to have clear shared expectations for the contents, the context. So how is that contextualized, and the meaning of the data that you can find, and that needs to be integrated and needs to be put together. And then there's a very important part of this. So you have seen that mainly, or maybe before, it's the called FAIR principles that come strongly from open science movement in Europe. FAIR stands for findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse of digital assets, thereby also data and metadata. And here I want to bring your attention to the bullets that you can see here. So it's the data usually needs to be integrated and need to be integrated with other data, and thereby metadata and data should use a language for knowledge representation, so something that is shared and accessible. Use vocabularies, common vocabularies that we also can use and reuse, describing the data and the metadata, and qualified references. So you find here also the links for sure, and can just follow your nose then later on to learn more about this. But this a little bit about the topic of interoperability, that we are aligned about what this talk is all about. In TRUSTS, our approach of interoperability is realized by a technology and an approach of knowledge graphs, and I will tell you in a minute what that means. But we have built, and we are still maintaining and expanding the TRUSTS knowledge graph. What does that mean? It's an interlinked system of objects where you find controlled vocabularies, you find all the code lists for the metadata that you need to classify it. You need, it's also used to enable entity linking for metadata and schema, for metadata mapping and schema mapping. What does it mean? When new metadata comes into the system, the metadata usually has a schema that doesn't fit to ours. So we have a centralized schema, centralized categorization systems, and this knowledge graph allows and enables that we can map this incoming metadata with the metadata of TRUSTS. It allows enrichment of metadata by analyzing the data and metadata. Gartner calls that dynamic metadata. So the system goes into the data itself and looks up the named entities, it looks up the classes, it looks up what is inside, and then maps that to the knowledge graph, and thereby you can easily find or you can specify and then find what is in the data, what is in the metadata, and can then say, give me all the data sets that are about a certain statistic in a certain region and maybe in a certain, from a time period, a timeline. And then the system knows exactly where this data is in. That's called dynamic metadata. And it can contextualize, or it contextualizes the data services, but you also have organizations and users in a data space or a data market. So you have to take into account these data space objects, as I call them. This knowledge graph is based on mainly two information models. These information models are based also on other standards already in place. The one is the, I think Jan mentioned it, the IDSA, International Data Space Association Information Model. And the second one we have taken from the Data Market Austria, the DMA. These are the two projects that TRUSTS is based upon. And we have integrated these models into a new TRUSTS model that is very, very similar to the ITSA information model. We just have here and there a few ideas and recommendations that this information model can be expanded. And here we go already into the area of interoperability, because every system marketplace data space that is following the ITSA information model then is somehow already interoperable with TRUSTS. Also, there are several code lists you can imagine, like ISO languages, like DCAT themes. These are classification schemes of data sets, or industry codes. There are taxonomies inside Eurovoc, for example, is integrated, that is used by the European Commission for classification and annotation of nearly all, also the data sets in the European data portal. Domain-specific vocabularies also along use cases. For example, when you speak about money laundering, FIBO is an interesting one, finance, ontology, and taxonomy. And it is based upon established standards for metadata and data management. And for this, I give you one slide without going into the super nitty-gritty details, because this is even not all of the standards that TRUSTS is using, but it gives a little bit of an overview what is inside this TRUSTS box. So you see the TRUSTS IM stands for information model. And then on the left-hand side, and that is very nice, and this helps you already also to go deeper into this topic of interoperability, you see which areas in which colors support to answer a question. So for example, how are things described? How are catalogs organized? You see here the orange or red in the middle. This is DCAT app, a very well used standard established by W3C, but also by the ISA program that is responsible for public administration in the European Union. How are things permissioned? There's ODRL, for example, a W3C standard again, explaining and specifying permissions. How are things accessed? What categories do things belong to? That was Eurovoc that I mentioned before as an example. How are descriptions specified, transmitted, and queries? And finally, what do we expect from data and metadata? And then you see, this is a box in a box. So we're using existing standards to ensure interoperability. And then we put them together so we're using that standards and we're putting these standards together into the TRUSTS information model. Coming back to the topic of the knowledge graph, because I mentioned this, and here you have a little specification or a definition saying a knowledge graph contains objects and topics that are closely interlinked, classified, semantically enriched, and connected to existing data and documents. Documents are mentioned here because for sure we have unstructured and structured data, and thereby also the knowledge graph supports unstructured data in the form of documents or just floating text. So TRUSTS can do both of them. And you see here little pictures at the bottom. You have the different sources or the different data repositories where all the data, the content comes in. Then you have a metadata layer and something we call the semantic layer or the conceptual and linguistic model that is combining, explaining the data and metadata. And on top, you can build smart applications that we call semantic AI applications. So this is a 4-layered data or content architecture where this knowledge graph is center in the middle that connects these things, provides meaning, context, as we have seen, what is an important factor for interoperability. Yeah, the good news is a little bit this picture that looks like a big thing, but the good news is that the main part of such a knowledge graph can be done automatically. So you see it, the main part here beneath the water that you usually not see. You can do corpus analysis, RDF transformation, machine learning parts. You can do what I mentioned before or apply it. It's called dynamic metadata, going into the data and the metadata itself and extracting thereby the classes and the categories and the meaning so that you can map your data and metadata to this knowledge graph. There's a very thin layer here, the C in our picture, that is supervised learning. And then we have a part that is manually created. An information model always needs human beings a little bit that model and integrate the different schemas that we have. We need human beings that really understand the topic, domains experts, if you go into the use cases for domain-specific vocabularies and so on and so forth. How can this be applied? So this is called the knowledge graph, vocabularies, and NLP. So natural language processing in our case here. And it gives you a little bit of an example how this happens, so how this also dynamic metadata works. So on the one hand, you have your models, or you have your taxonomies, ontologies, your basic knowledge graph, and then you apply this onto your data, your metadata, but also to your text, so your unstructured, and you identify and extract, for example, named entities, but also relations. Named entities could be regions, can be topics that you have in your graph, that can be organizations that you have inside the data and so on. And you map this to your model, and thereby the model is becoming richer because you always have also a feedback loop as a supervised learning. So he says, if there are new concepts that have not been known by the graph before, this can be suggested and put into the graph. And you establish all these links between the different data sets and documents. And thereby on top, you can easily then use unstructured data, semi-structured data, structured data, and map this onto your knowledge graph and put on top something like powerful applications I come to in a minute. Also, looking at the time, I think I'm well in time, but we can use a little bit here for the benefits and the summary. So this TRUSTS knowledge graph, what are the benefits of it? It provides an interlinked contextualized network of all data space objects. That can be classes, categories, but also the data sets, the metadata sets, and what is inside for sure. All the objects that are relevant. You also have users, you have organizations, maybe you have data related services also in your data space, and that can be used for this. You remember the meaning and the context that was mentioned at the FAIR principles regarding interoperability. So the graph can provide that. The graph furthermore enables search, recommender, and or broker services, if you want to call it like this, but also other data space services. So the data space, the data markets needs a powerful search system. It needs something like a digital broker. We could also call it a recommender system. So imagine you have a profile yourself, you're interested in very specific data sets that you would like to look at. But even then, this system is a learning system. So after, with a time, we can do personalization. The system can suggest to you data sets that could be of relevance for your work or for your use cases, even if they are not in the same category. And this is what it means here with a recommender or broker. It supports a high quality data governance approach. So along the data life cycle that we have in place, the graph can also support in this direction. It enables efficient data and metadata ingestion and delivery. What do I mean with this? As I said, data and metadata is coming in different schemas, with different attributes and so on and so forth. That's a natural thing because usually metadata is modeled by human beings and our construction of the world is a little bit different. So what we're doing here is when data and metadata is ingested, harvested and integrated into the data space, then we already do this mapping that I have explained before, but also the other way around. So when we deliver metadata to a third party, to a federated system, for example, that wants to make use of the metadata and data of trusts, mainly of the metadata, because the data can only be shared for sure and delivered with the okay of the owner or publisher. Then we also use this knowledge graph to provide more or less a standard or interoperability in data sharing or metadata sharing. We are standards compliant, as I mentioned before, and I'll show you this big picture. The main standardization organizations here is the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, and the ISA, the International Standards Organization. And thereby, TRUSTS has it ensures adaptation. So also the TRUSTS technology can be used and reused, and it's scalable regarding its business cases, because Jan has shown 3 of them. That is the main focus of TRUSTS, but with a knowledge graph behind, with a model using standards and ensuring interoperability, you can scale out to more and more use cases. Finally, it's rich in semantics, and that's what's, again, saying this, I said it before, it's providing context, it's providing meaning, and thereby, yeah, it's very useful. And all of that together, as you can see here, the assumption of this talk is a knowledge graph is an enabler for data space interoperability. It's also an enabler for interoperability inside an organization for sure, but here it's applied to data spaces. This is the final slide before we maybe open up the panel and have discussions. Have a look if we have questions from your side. If you have any, please put them into the chat of this stream. We are happy to take them directly or answer them also in the chat then. So if you're interested to learn more about knowledge graphs, I have a recommendation of a book that colleagues of mine have been writing and publishing. So the first edition was last year in April 2020. It's also available for free. You just use here the slides, you click the free PDF and you can immediately start reading. It's somehow based on more than 20 years of industry experience. So this book is very much focused on industry use cases, also then handing over to business cases. Yeah, you see it's 7 chapters. It has an addendum, infographics, and what is important also, you have 11 expert interviews about knowledge graphs inside. It's called the Knowledge Graph Cookbook, Recipes That Work. And yeah, just take a look at this, but also get in touch with us with any questions. And this is all from the topic from my side about interoperability in trusts. And let's see where we are and where the colleague is. Jan, you're here again. Did you see if we have any questions, pressing questions?
Yes, in fact, we have several questions in the chat and some nice discussion. Yeah, so let's maybe start from the top. Yeah, so Rigo Wenning asked about the interesting relationship between Gaia X and Google, which is indeed interesting. Of course, yeah, as Martin also already wrote back in the chat, we are not Gaia X, we are TRUSTS. I just mentioned the Gaia X initiative because, of course, it's important for us to keep aligned with important initiatives. But yes, it's an interesting relationship because, yeah, I mean, obviously, no one really wants to somehow be against the hyperscalers. I mein, we are all using their services on a daily basis. Probably literally all of us, and we are glad they exist. Gaia X has the goal to somehow be able to provide a counterbalance on a global scale, but not the goal to fight the hyperscalers, but to work together with them. And that's yeah, the situation, and Google and also Microsoft are getting involved, and the goal is, of course, to cooperate with them because they have the resources, they have the knowledge, but to be able to establish an infrastructure there that very much yeah, is in line with European values and rules. But again, yeah, TRUSTS is not Gaia X, just basically as a side comment. Although, of course, we have the same goals, basically. So even TRUSTS has the goal to allow data sharing in a way that is compliant with European laws and regulations. So let me see. There was another question from Rico Wenning about the trust ontology or taxonomy to assess trust. And I think your second question in particular shows that it goes in the direction of who can I trust to give my data? So your question is, can I require a certain level of trust for my data to be processed? The point here is, yes, of course, you can. The goal is actually even to decide on a case-by-case data whom a data provider gives their data. So it is not even that you just have like a data trust level and you say, well, I give my data to anyone above the level of 0.5 or whatever metric you want to have. It's not even, it's even more restricted as that because usually you cannot give a global value to the trust that you can give to another company for processing your data in this particular scenario of data sharing, because it really depends on the particular piece of data. So firstly, there may be rules attached what you're even allowed to do with the data. If it's personal data, you need explicit consent of the people from where the data originates for what you can do with it and whom you can pass it on to and what they can do with it. And even if it's industrial data, it's usually sensitive. It may be a company asset, which should not come to in the hands of your competitors. So even though you may trust your competitors in some sense, you may not want to give them your own data. So it really, trust is, I think, in the context of data sharing, not an absolute value, but it really depends on the actual data you want to share. And that's why here in this context, it's really a case-by-case decision whom to make your data available and to define the rules, what they can actually do with the data, and make sure that these rules are actually respected.
Maybe just one sentence, sorry to interrupt you here. So, I mean, trust in data spaces, data markets, it's about data trading and about collaboration in data. And as we also know from our, let's say, business relations, trust comes also a little bit between human beings. And that's something I really want to stress also. So it's not you put it into a data catalog and everybody can, as Jan said, take it out and consume it. It's really bilateral collaboration or trading or buying and selling, demand and supply of data. So this is what data spaces and trust is all about. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, very much so. There's another question from Rigo about whether we use RRDF star, and I think Martin, you are the better one to answer that question. Yes.
Yep. No, we're not using it yet, but I think it's a very good remark and good idea to have a look, because then you can really walk through the edges of a graph and can make additional findings. So we have it on the radar. It's it's not integrated yet. I think the question came from Rigo. I also saw it before. So we'll have a look at this standard as well.
Yeah. And another, in fact, very interesting suggestion or question, whether the TRUSTS project is considering the SOLID project, so the web centralization project, which has been going on for a couple of years now. So we can say that our goals are actually quite similar. So our goal is also to be able to provide a decentralized infrastructure, which allows the possibility of federation of data sharing facilities. And again, also SOLID has the goal to provide decentralization in the context of the web. So in that sense, yes, it is a very interesting initiative. We're not based on it yet, partly probably because of historic reasons, because actually, yes, SOLID and the IDS initiative, which is part of our background in our project, have been developed in parallel, both starting about 5 years ago, as far as I can see. And basically, yeah, so TRUSTS is built on IDS as well as the data market Austria technologies. So I think the question would be more generally whether it might be interesting to for the IDS initiative to have a look at Solid and see whether it can be integrated. But I think that's or whether one can at least reuse concepts that have been developed there. But I think it's a good question, a good suggestion, and I think we should take that with us anyway.
Absolutely. I think there was also a discussion between is Solid a W3C recommendation or not. Rigo already, I mean, who could answer that better than Rigo, being the legal counsel of W3C. So it was the basic idea comes from Tim Berners-Lee, as far as I know, but it is still not a recommendation because a W3C recommendation needs to go through a process with a working group, people working together, specifying this recommendation, or call it standard if you want to, and then it will be announced and published. And I think Solid is just not through that process. But I don't want to answer Rigo's part here, and I think that's important. And there was a final one, I think, also on the Metadata movement that we also.
So, yes, so I think we can say yes, we're in touch with the colleagues from Metadata. So also again, a very interesting initiative there, which shares many of the goals we have here. So we are talking to colleagues from Metadata, in fact. So indeed, the goal should be to come together in the future more closely and basically align with that initiative as well. So it's a very exciting initiative there. I think we should do that, yes.
Definitely.
And that's the last question on RDF. You already answered it.
Yeah, I already tried, but we can take it here. So the question was, can RDF provide an interoperability layer between Solid and IDS? So RDF, as the long name says, Resource Description Framework. It's a framework, so it's kind of a language that you can express very many and lots of things, but the work needs to be done. So for sure, you can use RDF for this, but the mapping, the writing of the RDF code, so to say, is something somebody needs to do. But for sure, you can use RDF for that mapping. That's the idea also for RDF. Okay. Thank you, Rigo. That's a good point. I mean, I know Ruben well. I don't know Lalana, but I think that's a very good point to have a look at the papers and also share that with our colleagues about this Solid and IDS mapping. I think, but I'm not sure, maybe Jan, you know more about it. What I always also been thinking is that a mapping between IDS and the EOSC information model would be very important, because we know we always say European, so we always say, we don't have the Googles, we don't have the Amazons, we are not having this data, but we have this unbelievable rich European open science base, so the EOSC, and they also develop models. So we know this joke, right? The two people coming together and saying, oh, you know, there are 14 standards out there of interoperability. So let's map them together. And what happens is there's the standard number 15 then at the very end. So that should not happen. Do you know if something is going on here already?
Yeah, so at least there are certainly points of contacts with the EOSC initiative. So the European Open Science Cloud, as you say, also a very important initiative for federating, in this case, HP infrastructures used for scientific computations. And yeah, again, I would also think it would be very interesting to align with this initiative. Maybe the sort of the distinction between EOSC and TRUSTS may be that, at least in our use cases, we have been concentrating more on company use cases and not so much on scientific computing. But of course, that doesn't need to be a sort of a contradiction. In both cases, you need to do intelligent analysis of data. And indeed, I agree that it would make sense to align the scientific and the commercial infrastructures just in order to increase flexibility and efficiency in the use of those infrastructures. And yeah, so that should be very much the goal to do that.
Absolutely. I think there are final discussions about data lakes and semantic data lakes. I would just stress, I put it into the chat already, Gartner calls this a semantic data fabric. Doesn't mean that Gartner is right with everything they say. Don't get me wrong, but I like this idea because it puts more or less the linking and the context and the meaning on top of a data lake, of this idea, putting everything just into a lake, throw it in, and then magic happens. And we have seen that didn't really work properly because the magic didn't happen. So, but I think what you mean, Rigo, a semantic data lake is very similar to a semantic data fabric, as Gartner calls it. So it's really then putting in somehow interlinking context, meaning that you really can make more out of the data. You find it again, you get recommendations, you can easily integrate the things, and so on and so forth. So I think that's, from my side at least, the answer.
Yes, but of course, always keeping in mind the constraints that may be associated with the data. So from the point of view of the user, it's a data lake. So the company that has access to part of the data, that part is a data lake. But it's not one sort of unified data lake where all the data can be accessed by everyone, because the provider of the data may have constraints on who may be able to access it and what they can do with it. Because this is often sensitive data, because it may be either personal or company sensitive data. That usually the data provider makes restriction on which other party may be able to access and use it.
Right. Fully agree here. I think we're good with the questions, but
yeah, and if there are other ones, we still have a couple of minutes. There are other questions, please fire them ahead.
Also feel free to get in touch with us on LinkedIn or via the TRUSTS website. I put it into the chat, so we also can just get in touch with us, but also with our project coordinator, as Jan said. That is the University of Hanover, and fire questions there. And also, if you say we are also working in the area of data spaces or data markets, we're very highly interested to exchange knowledge and discuss together what we have achieved and what you have achieved. So just feel free to contact us for sure. And otherwise, we can do a little wrap up and summary, Jan, if you want to.
Yeah. Fine with me, yes. So thanks a lot for all the great questions and discussions. So as the questions and comments also indicated, that in fact the goal of federation of data sharing platform is very important. Several initiatives were mentioned, which are also quite important to what we're doing and have similar goals. So in fact, this emphasizes our impression that federation is important, being able to federate the different infrastructures that already exist, which have the goal to share data or to share data analysis facilities and infrastructures. And this is part of what the TRUSTS project very much wants to do in a trusted, secure, and trustworthy environment. And so thanks a lot again for being able to use some time to present to you what we are doing. If you're interested in more information, as Martin already said, please don't hesitate to get in contact with us. And otherwise, again, thanks a lot for your questions and comments. And I leave it to Martin to also say goodbye.
Absolutely. So first of all, thanks to you, Jan, was a fine thing, this double conference that we had the last hour. Thanks to all of you for participation and raising the questions regarding interoperability, also a topic if you're interested, we are happy to discuss. We are also here in touch, maybe to mention, with the BDVA, but also with W3C, with the initiatives going on, because there is more and more standards are developing in the field of data spaces and data sharing, and that's important also. Yeah. That's all from my side. Thank you very much. Thanks to you. Have a great day and enjoy the forum and the conference this and the coming days. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Cheers.